There's a house on a quiet street in Patchogue, New York, a modest two-story home, the kind you would drive past without a second glance. Lawns trimmed, neighbors who nod hello. A town so ordinary it barely registers on a map. Inside that world, or near it anyway, live three elderly brothers. They share a landscaping business. They go to work. They keep to themselves. They have lived their entire lives under a name that the world associates with absolute evil. A name that starts a war inside every room they enter. Except that no one in that room knows it, because decades ago they buried that name. They replaced it with something that gives nothing away, and in doing so, they also made what may be the most haunting private decision in modern history. Adolf Hitler is one of the most recognizable figures who ever lived. His name is synonymous with genocide, destruction, and the industrialized murder of millions of human beings. The scale of what he set in motion between 1939 and 1945 remains almost incomprehensible. Over 70 million people killed in the Second World War, and among them, 6 million Jewish men, women, and children systematically exterminated in what we now call the Holocaust. He died in April 1945, alone in a bunker beneath a burning city, and the world exhaled. But here is something most people have never thought about. He left family behind, not children, not a dynasty, but blood relatives, nephews, cousins, descendants who shared his lineage whether they wanted to or not. And what those relatives eventually decided to do with that inheritance is the story we are telling today. The Bunker. April 1945. Picture Berlin in the final days of April 1945. The city is unraveling. Soviet artillery has been pounding the streets for weeks. Entire neighborhoods have been reduced to rubble and ash. The air smells of smoke and death and the desperation of a regime that knows it has lost. More than 2 million Red Army soldiers are closing the ring around the German capital, street by street, block by block. Beneath the Reich Chancellery, in a fortified underground complex known as the Führer Bunker, Adolf Hitler has been living like a man buried alive. He moved into this subterranean world on January 16, 1945, and over the following 105 days, he barely left it. The bunker was lavishly furnished, with expensive rugs covering the concrete floors and oil paintings lining the walls. Among them, prominently displayed above his desk, hung a portrait of Frederick the Great, one of Hitler's historical idols. It was the closest thing to daylight he allowed himself. By the morning of April 29th, the sounds of Soviet artillery were no longer distant. They were blocks away. His personal staff were burning documents. His SS bodyguards were destroying records. His dog, Blondie, had already been poisoned with cyanide capsules, a test, some believed, for the ones that would follow. In the small hours of that morning, Hitler dictated his final will and political testament to his secretary, Traudl Junge. In it, characteristically, he blamed the Jews for everything: the war, Germany's destruction, his own downfall. Then, just after midnight, Adolf Hitler married his longtime companion Eva Braun in a small civil ceremony inside the bunker. It was attended by a handful of staff. The two of them swore they were of pure Aryan blood, as Nazi law required. A brief, muted reception followed, during which groups of bunker staff quietly celebrated, because it was, according to witnesses, the first occasion in weeks that had given anyone anything to smile about. Less than 40 hours later, on the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, with Soviet forces now fighting in the streets directly above him, Hitler and Eva Braun withdrew to his private sitting room. Eva swallowed a cyanide capsule. Hitler shot himself in the right temple. Their bodies were wrapped and carried up to the Reich Chancellery Garden, doused in petrol and set alight. A Soviet artillery shell was falling on the grounds almost continuously, so the guard charged with the cremation ran to the bunker entrance, tossed a lit match, and retreated. When investigators arrived days later, they found a shallow bomb crater, a handful of charred remains, and an SS officer's cap lying among the debris. The man who had plunged the world into its most catastrophic conflict was gone. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12, and the silence that settled over Berlin in the days that followed carried for much of the world the feeling of something finally, irreversibly over. But it was not over, not entirely, not for the people who shared his blood. The family no one talks about. Adolf Hitler never had children. This is a historically established fact. His marriage to Eva Braun lasted less than 2 days and produced no offspring. He had no legitimate heirs, no dynasty prepared to continue his name. But he did have family. His immediate relatives were, by 1945, scattered and diminished. His younger sister Paula, the only full sibling to survive to adulthood, lived quietly in Austria after the war under an assumed name, and died in 1960 without children. His father, Alois Hitler, had died in 1903, his mother, Clara, in 1907. The extended family, however, was more complicated. Adolf Hitler's father, Alois, had been married 3 times. From his earlier marriages and relationships came 2 older children, a daughter named Angela and a son named Alois Hitler Jr. These were Adolf's half-siblings. And it is through them and through their children that the Hitler bloodline quietly survived the war. From Angela's line came Leo Raubel Jr., and eventually 2 men who live today in Austria, Peter Raubel, born in 1931, a retired engineer who has spent his adult life in Linz, and Heiner Hoschegger, born in January 1945, who lives an intensely private existence in the Graz region. Neither has ever married, neither has children. From Alois Jr.'s line came someone whose story is far more dramatic and far more surprising, a man named William Patrick Hitler. The nephew from Liverpool, March 12, 1911, Toxteth, Liverpool, England. In a modest flat at 102 Upper Stanhope Street, a boy is born to an Irish woman named Bridget Dowling and her Austrian husband, Alois Hitler Jr. They name him William Patrick Hitler. Bridget had met Alois in Dublin in 1909. He was working at the Shelbourne Hotel, cutting a handsome figure in European clothes. She was 17, fresh out of convent school, and by her own later account, deeply impressed by this foreigner with his fine manners and continental air. The pair eloped to London, married in Marylebone, and settled in Liverpool to build a life together. That life did not last long. In 1914, when William Patrick was barely 3 years old, Alois left, supposedly for a gambling tour of Europe. He never came back. The outbreak of the First World War made return to England impossible, and so Alois simply stayed in Germany. He remarried bigamously. He started a new family. He sent word eventually that he was dead until 1924, when a bigamy case in Germany revealed he was very much alive. William Patrick, raised entirely by his Irish mother in a working-class Liverpool flat, grew up almost entirely disconnected from his German relatives. He knew his surname. He knew in the abstract that he had an uncle somewhere in Germany who was involved in politics. Beyond that, there was largely silence. In 1929, when William turned 18, his father wrote to Bridget asking her to send the boy to Germany for a visit. She agreed, and so William made his first trip across the North Sea to reconnect with the father who had abandoned him as a toddler. What he found was not just a father. He found a country in the grip of an idea, and an uncle who was becoming its most powerful symbol. Alois took his son to a Nazi party rally, where William Patrick Hitler watched the man he vaguely knew as his uncle whip an enormous crowd into a frenzy of nationalist fervor. He was, by all accounts, both fascinated and unsettled. He returned to England. He wrote some articles about his uncle for British newspapers. Adolf, who was extraordinarily sensitive to any exposure of his private life, summoned William to Berlin to dress him down over those articles. The relationship between uncle and nephew was established early on as transactional, uneasy, and shot through with mutual suspicion. The loathsome nephew. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. The Weimar Republic was over. The Nazi state was beginning. And William Patrick Hitler, unemployed in England and struggling to find work, in part because his surname had become a liability, made a decision. He traveled back to Germany, not out of ideological conviction, not because he believed in what his uncle was building, but because he saw an opportunity, and he intended to use it. He was, as many who studied him would later conclude, an opportunist first. Adolf found him a job at the Reichsbank in Berlin. William worked there for most of the 1930s and later moved to the Opel automobile factory, first as a worker and then as a car salesman. None of these positions satisfied him. He kept pushing for more, a better title, a more senior role, more money. Adolf Hitler, who was ferociously protective of his public image and deeply wary of any family member who might expose the complicated, messy reality behind the Aryan mythology he had constructed, grew increasingly irritated with his persistent nephew. He sent spies to watch him. He had William's movements monitored. At one point, William was arrested in a cafe and sent to a prison in Lichterfelde, simply because the officers did not believe he was really related to Hitler. The British embassy had to intervene to secure his release. "I didn't become chancellor for the benefit of my family," Hitler reportedly said. "No one is going to climb on my back." He began referring to William in private as my loathsome nephew. The feeling, over time, became mutual. Desperate and increasingly resentful, William made a move that was either extraordinarily bold or extraordinarily reckless, depending on how you look at it. He threatened to blackmail his uncle. He would confirm publicly in the press the long-standing rumor that Hitler's paternal grandfather had actually been a Jewish merchant named Leopold Frankenberger, who had fathered Alois Hitler Sr. out of wedlock. This was, in historical terms, a rumor with no credible basis. Historians have since established that there is no evidence of Jewish ancestry in Hitler's family. But in 1930s Germany, the accusation alone, whispered about in the right circles, printed in the right newspapers, could have been devastating to a regime built on racial ideology. The blackmail worked. William's salary was doubled, but things were deteriorating. In 1938, Adolf gave his nephew an ultimatum. Renounce your British citizenship, and I'll give you a high-ranking position in the government. William, suspecting, correctly, that this was a trap designed to keep him in Germany, where he could be controlled or silenced, fled back to England. In London, he gave an interview to the Times in which he said with startling clarity, "I believe he has created a Frankenstein which even he perhaps cannot stop. I think he has it in his power to destroy European civilization and perhaps that of the entire world." He also wrote an article for Look magazine in America. Its title was simply, Why I Hate My Uncle. A Hitler who fought against Hitler in January 1939, newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst brought William Patrick Hitler and his mother Bridget to the United States for a lecture tour. William traveled the country speaking about his uncle, warning American audiences about the Nazi threat at a time when isolationist sentiment was still strong and many Americans were reluctant to believe war in Europe was their problem. The tour was called with remarkable directness, My Uncle Adolf. When the Second World War broke out later that year, William and his mother were stranded in the United States. William tried to join the British Armed Forces. He was rejected. His direct relation to Adolf Hitler made his loyalties, at least in the eyes of military bureaucrats, too uncertain to risk. He tried the American military next, with similar results. Turned away again. So William Patrick Hitler did something remarkable. He wrote directly to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, making a personal appeal. The letter was turned over to the FBI for investigation. Agents investigated his background, his movements, his time in Germany, and eventually they made a decision. On March 6, 1944, William Patrick Hitler was sworn into the United States Navy at a recruiting station in New York City. The moment of induction has become the stuff of dark historical comedy. When the intake officer asked for his name, William replied, "Hitler." The officer, presumably assuming he was joking, replied, "Glad to see you, Hitler. My name's Hess." The coincidence, Rudolf Hess was Adolf Hitler's deputy Führer, was almost too perfect. William served as a pharmacist's mate, working in medical and hospital roles. Records indicate he served in the Pacific Theater. He was wounded in action and awarded the Purple Heart. When he was discharged in 1947 after 3 years of service, he had done something that almost no one in history had done: carried the name Hitler while actively fighting against the Nazi regime. It was a rejection of everything that name had come to mean, and it was only the beginning. Erasing the name. The war was over. Hitler was dead. The concentration camps had been opened and their horrors exposed. Nuremberg was underway. The full industrial scale of the genocide was becoming impossible for the world to absorb. And William Patrick Hitler was a free man in America, with a name that now carried an almost unbearable weight. He changed it. First to Hiller, a name other Hitler relatives in Germany were also adopting in the post-war chaos. Then, for reasons that remain unclear, to something more elaborate: Stuart-Houston. Some observers have noted an uncomfortable similarity to the name of Houston Stewart Chamberlain, a British-born racialist writer who had been one of the ideological architects of Nazi thinking. Whether the name was chosen for that reason, by coincidence, or simply for its vague Anglo-Irish elegance, no definitive explanation was ever given. William Patrick Stuart-Houston, as he was now legally known, settled with his mother in Patchogue, a small town on Long Island, New York. Using the medical training he had acquired in the Navy, he established a business called Brookhaven Laboratories in his home at 71 Silver Street, a 2-story clapboard house. The lab analyzed blood samples for local hospitals. The irony of Hitler's nephew running a blood laboratory is the kind of detail that fiction writers would reject as too on the nose. In 1947, he married Phyllis Jean-Jacques, a German-born American woman, and over the following years, they had 4 sons. 4 boys raised in an ordinary American town, attending ordinary American schools, living in a house where the past was kept behind a carefully sealed door. The 4 brothers, their names were Alexander Adolf, Louis Howard Ronald, and Brian William, all born between 1949 and 1965. Their surnames were Stuart-Houston. Their father never spoke publicly about his past. Their neighborhood knew nothing about who they really were. They grew up American. That is the only description that truly applies. They played in the streets of Long Island. They went to school. They held jobs. Alexander eventually became a social worker. Louis and Brian went into landscaping together and ran a small business for decades. Howard became a special agent with the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service, essentially a federal detective pursuing financial crimes. Neighbors who later learned the truth after journalists began tracking the family down in the 1990s consistently described them as excellent people, quiet, hardworking, unremarkable in the best possible way. But the thing that made them remarkable, the thing that would eventually draw international attention, was what they had not done. None of them had married. None of them had children. Howard came the closest. He had been engaged and by all accounts intended to start a family. But on September 14, 1989, he was killed in a car accident. He was 32 years old. He died childless. 3 brothers remained, and none of them were showing any signs of wanting to change the pattern. The Pact, or something like it. In the late 1990s, a British journalist named David Gardner spent years attempting to track down William Patrick, Hitler's family. He searched phone books under both Hitler and the various name changes the family had made. He traced death certificates, immigration records, birth registrations. The trail was cold and deliberately obscured, but eventually he found them. When Gardner knocked on the door in Patchogue, it was the first time, as he later described it, that anyone had come looking for the family in 50 years. His 2001 book, The Last of the Hitlers, brought the story to wide international attention for the first time, and central to that book was a question that has haunted the story ever since. Had the brothers made a pact? Gardner's conclusion was characteristically careful. He told CNN in 2002. They didn't sign a pact, but what they did is they talked amongst themselves, talked about the burden they've had in the background of their lives, and decided that none of them would marry. None of them would have children. And that's a pact they've kept to this day. 3 brothers, all in the same small town, all working ordinary jobs, all childless, all unmarried. Alexander, the eldest, born in 1949, and carrying the remarkable middle name Adolf, initially denied the pact when Gardner approached him. He said his brothers may have discussed something he was not part of. In a later interview with the German newspaper Bild in 2018, he went further and called the pact theory bullshit, insisting the decision not to have children was not some grand coordinated gesture. He also revealed something that added an entirely different layer of poignancy to the story. One of his brothers, he said, had once been engaged to be married. His fiancée was Jewish. When she eventually discovered the family's connection to Adolf Hitler, she ended the engagement. Hitler's great nephew, potentially on the verge of creating a family that would have bound the bloodline of the man responsible for the Holocaust to the very community he sought to destroy, had that possibility ended by the weight of a name he could not escape. The story resists easy conclusions. Was it a formal pact, sealed in conversation, or simply the accumulated weight of circumstances grinding down the possibility of a normal life? Was it a conscious moral decision, or was it the result of a name that made relationships, intimacy, and normalcy perpetually, quietly impossible? Alexander himself said only, "We discussed writing a book about our lives once. We changed our minds. We won't do it, not for all the money in the world." The weight of a name. Here is a question that researchers have spent decades trying to answer. What does it actually feel like to inherit a name like this? The psychology of perpetrators' descendants, children and grandchildren of those who committed atrocities, has been extensively studied, particularly in the German-speaking world in the decades after the war. There is even a German word for it, Ahnenschuld, ancestral guilt, a feeling of remorse linked to familial connection to Nazism, distinct from legal responsibility. Research on these descendants describes a phenomenon that psychologists distinguish carefully from guilt. It is closer to shame, the corrosive, identity-shaping experience of feeling that who you are is contaminated, even though what you did is precisely nothing. As one study framed it, people in this position carry a name that enters the room before they do. It affects when, or whether, they tell a romantic partner the truth about their family. It shapes employment decisions. It colors every new relationship with an invisible asterisk. Several interviewees in research on children and grandchildren of Nazi perpetrators spoke specifically about the question of parenthood, about whether to have children at all, about whether it was right to pass on a lineage tied, however tenuously, to something monstrous. For the Stuart-Houston brothers, this question was not abstract. It was the defining question of their lives, and the answer they appear to have arrived at, whatever form that answer took, was no. The line ends with us. Bettina Göring, great niece of Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring, made a similar choice, but took it further. She and her brother were both sterilized. "We both did it so there won't be any more Görings," she told the BBC. "When my brother had it done, he said to me, 'I cut the line.'" For the Stuart-Houston brothers, the method was different, but the intention, if the accounts are accurate, was the same. Myths, rumors, and what historians actually know. Over the decades, the question of Hitler's descendants has attracted its share of wild speculation, conspiratorial thinking, and outright fabrication. The most prominent claim involves a French railway worker named Jean-Marie Lauré, who died in 1985 after spending decades insisting he was Adolf Hitler's illegitimate son, the product of a brief affair between Hitler, then a corporal in the German army, and a young French woman named Charlotte Lovejoy during the First World War. Lauret wrote an autobiography about his search for the truth, hired historians and handwriting analysts and geneticists, and argued that the evidence, including watercolor paintings Hitler made of Lovejoy, similar handwriting between the two men, and German army records showing cash deliveries to Lovejoy during the Nazi occupation, supported his claim. The mainstream historical consensus, however, is deeply skeptical. Lauret's DNA was tested by researchers and found not to match known Hitler family members. Prominent historians, including Ian Kershaw and Anton Joachimsthaler, have argued that the claim is highly unlikely, if not impossible, to prove. Hitler himself denied having any children on multiple occasions, and while certain pieces of circumstantial evidence are intriguing, no definitive proof has ever emerged to establish the connection. The Lauret story illustrates a broader pattern: the tremendous fascination people have with the idea of Hitler's direct genetic continuation, and the willingness to fill that fascination with speculation when the evidence is thin. Claims of secret children, hidden families in South America, surviving heirs to some imagined Nazi dynasty. These stories have circulated for decades without credible historical foundation. What historians can confirm, and what the documentary record supports, is this. As of 2025, 5 people are known to be living members of Adolf Hitler's extended family. 3 of them are the Stuart-Houston brothers in Patchogue, Long Island. 2 of them, Peter Raubel and Heiner Hoschegger, live in Austria, descended from Hitler's half-sister, Angela. All 5 are elderly. None has children. They have also notably refused to claim any financial benefit from Hitler's legacy, Royalties from Mein Kampf, where applicable, have been declined. No one has traded on the connection. None of them have sought interviews, except for Alexander's rare and reluctant appearances over the decades. When Peter Raubel, the retired Austrian engineer, is approached by journalists, he says simply that he has nothing to add to what is already known. When Heiner Hochegger's identity was first publicly established in 2004, he disappeared back into anonymity and has barely surfaced since. They have chosen silence. And in the modern world, where silence is increasingly difficult to maintain, that itself is a kind of statement. What remains today? The spot where Hitler's bunker once stood is a parking lot in the government district of central Berlin. There's a small information panel marking the significance of the location. The panel is understated, deliberately so. Germany has made a national project of refusing to allow Nazi sites to become shrines. The bunker's concrete shell remains beneath the asphalt, largely intact, visited by no one except the cars that park above it. Somewhere in that same city's suburban sprawl, in the ordinary neighborhoods and quiet streets that Berlin has become, life continues with no visible connection to what happened beneath that ground in April 1945. And in Patchogue, New York, a place so far from all of that history that the distance feels almost deliberate. 3 elderly brothers go about their lives. Alexander, now in his mid-70s, Louis in his early 70s, Brian, the youngest, approaching his 60s. They tend to their landscaping business. They live a few blocks from each other. They do not seek attention. They have turned down book deals. They will not participate in documentaries. They would not give this script its ending if they knew it existed, but they are there. And as the years pass and the generation that remembers the Second World War firsthand grows smaller, the question of what their silence means and what it will eventually resolve into grows larger. The final chapter. History is full of lineages that ended. Most of them ended without intention, through accident, illness, war, simple misfortune, or the ordinary chaos of human life. The bloodlines of kings and conquerors, generals and emperors, visionaries and monsters, they tapered and vanished across centuries without any single moment of decision. What makes the story of Hitler's descendants different is the suggestion, unproven, contested, but stubbornly present in the historical record, that the ending here may have been chosen. That 5 individuals, scattered across 2 continents, each carrying a connection they never asked for to the worst chapter of the 20th century, looked at that connection and said, "This ends with me." Not in anger, not in dramatic gestures or public declarations, but in the quiet, daily decisions of ordinary lives. The choice not to marry, the choice not to have children, the choice to maintain a silence so total that for decades the outside world didn't even know these people existed. David Gardner, who spent 4 years tracking them down, described the brothers in simple terms. They are all American lives. They were born in America. They have lived in America. They work ordinary jobs, pay ordinary taxes, and by every visible measure are indistinguishable from their neighbors. The only thing that sets them apart is the knowledge they carry and the decision they appear to have made about what to do with it. Adolf Hitler died believing he had set something in motion that would outlast him: a racial empire, an ideological order, a name that would echo across centuries. He spent the last hours of his life dictating a testament that continued to blame the Jews, continued to frame his catastrophic failure as the fault of others, continued to insist that history would vindicate him. Instead, history is doing something he never anticipated. It is watching his bloodline choose to disappear, not through violence, not through the intervention of enemies, but through the private, unhurried decision of the people who carry it, the last of the Hitlers, living ordinary lives in ordinary places, growing quietly older and leaving nothing behind. When the last of them dies, and statistically that day is not far off, there will be no heir to mourn them, no child to inherit whatever remains of that genetic thread, no continuation, just an ending. And in a story built on death and destruction and the deliberate erasure of lives that deserve to continue, there is something quietly remarkable about an ending that no one was forced into, that no war produced, and that no ideology demanded. An ending that was simply, privately chosen. Outro. If you found this story as fascinating and as haunting as I did when I first came across it, I would love to know your thoughts in the comments below. This is exactly the kind of story that the history books tend to leave out and that stays with you long after you finished reading. If you're new here, this is WW2 Tales, where we dig into the stories that history doesn't always tell in full. Every week we go beyond the famous battles and familiar names to find the human threads running underneath. Hit the like button if you found this valuable. It genuinely helps more people find this channel. And if you want to make sure you never miss a story like this one, subscribe and hit the bell so YouTube keeps you in the loop. I'll see you in the next one.